Funding for this program provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Asian American Telecommunications Association.
Si lumawi siya ng tsak-tsake ay waday isnang tungso ng lawag. Siya ng ikad isnang pake yanang unas. Siya ng mangi pango kung tsakani ta mangalaan ni isnang ulo ng
I left Manila for America more than 20 years ago, carrying dreams from a past I now barely recognize. In all these years, not once have I gone back. These are my children. They were born here in America. It is their home and the only life they know. Perhaps they are fortunate because they do not have to forget what they have never known. In the beginning, I lived in two worlds: the sights and sounds of my new life, and then the flickering after images of the place I once called home. The years pass, the urgency of my youthful dreams muted by the dailiness of life's events. Now my memories of life back home have faded to the point where it is sometimes difficult to know where reality ends and imagination begins. In remnant dreams, recurring landscapes persist. Back home is what I call it, though it isn't that anymore. Home is what you try to remember, not what you try to forget. What is the source of this talent of forgetting? In the Philippines, there is a saying, ang hindi lumilingon sa pinanggalingan, hindi makararating sa patutunguhan. He who does not look back from whence he came from will never ever reach his destination. We Filipinos wear this cloak of silence to render us invisible from one another. Yet it is the very thing that makes us recognize each other. After all, in this act of hiding, we are united. We are invisible, except to one another. To survive in this new land, we had to forget. The stream changes course, and slowly our ghost catches up. Now we must remember in order to survive. One day I will be gone, and these memories will be lost. Yet questions will remain. Why did we leave our home? Why have we come to America? Why have we chosen to stay? What are the stories that define us as a people? What has made us the way we are? One day the Moon Woman was making a large copper pot with the blunt edge of her axe. A boy crept behind her to watch her work. This boy was a child of the Sun God. Unaware, the Moon Woman continued her work. Suddenly the boy sneezed. Startled, the Moon Woman spun around with her axe. In the blink of an eye, the blade cut off the boy's head. The Sun God was not there and did not see what happened, but instantly he knew. He ran to the spot, picked the boy up, and put the head where it belonged. And the boy was alive. Then the Sun God said to the Moon Woman, "Because you cut off my child's head, the Earth people will cut off each other's heads, and will do so till the end of time. And so it is thus that the people have always cut off each other's heads." As a young boy growing up in the Philippines, I heard many stories about my two grandfathers. One of them, Emiliano, fought in the revolution against Spain in 1896. Many of Emiliano's companions were slaughtered on the battlefield because they lacked the weapons and ammunition to defeat the Spaniards in open fighting. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, attacking the Spanish fleet anchored at Manila Bay. 3 centuries of Spanish rule had ended. In February 1899, hostilities broke out after 3 Filipinos were shot by American soldiers outside Manila. The Philippine-American War had begun. This war ended in 1902, though the fighting continued in the countryside for many years after that. There were heavy casualties on the Filipino side, not only from gunfire, but from starvation and disease. My grandfather's body was never found. I suspect that he died in the trenches and was buried in some mass grave in the outskirts of Manila. My other grandfather, whose name was Marcod, proved to be a greater mystery. He was a Bontoc Igorot warrior who lived in the remote mountains of northern Luzon. He and several families in his tribe were sent to the United States in 1904 as participants in the St. Louis World's Fair. My mother said Marcod was a young chieftain, known for his skills as a warrior and hunter. That and the fact that he never returned home was all I knew about him. In our history lessons at school, my teachers talked about the many primitive tribes that populated the islands. The Negritos, Moros, and Igorots were among the most well-known. I knew that some of my relatives lived in the mountains, but the only way I got to know about them was from the pictures I saw and the books I read. These lessons sparked my interest in finding out more about Philippine tribal life. But as the years passed, all these were forgotten. Though the city was less than a day's drive from the Igorot villages, life in Manila was as far removed from tribal life as one could imagine. I often wondered how my life would have been different had my grandfather Marcod returned home to the mountains. As a child, when I shared my interest about the Igorots with my friends in school, they would ask me if I ever wore a G-string, or if I danced around a blazing fire at night beating a brass gong, or whether my mother served dog meat at home. The sad thing was, I never even met an Igorot in my whole life. I haven't given much thought about Marcod since I was a child, but I suspected that there was a much larger story behind his disappearance. I wanted to find out what really happened to him.
Si lumawi siya ng chak-chaki, ay wais ng tungtu.
Our God is the great God who lives in the sky and shines through the sun. He makes our rice and sugarcane grow, and He gives us the heads of our enemies. He lived a quiet life in his mountain village by the river. For many generations, his people hunted and worked the land, isolated from the rest of the islands. When the Americans first came to our village, we were afraid of them. Their guns made a lot of noise and scared everyone, including the animals in the forest. We did not like them visiting our villages. Later, we realized that they wanted to be our friends. They wanted us to go with them to America, where many were gathered, so we could build a village and show our ways of living. Many of the men in Marcod's clan wanted to see what was beyond the mountains, beyond the neighboring lowlands that was on the water's edge. Marcod wanted to go, but was hesitant because he knew his wife was expecting a child. They were assured that he would be back in time for his birth. With his wife's blessing, Marcod accepted the offer of this journey, this promise of adventure and fortune. That night, the people in his village danced and feasted on many animals. In his letters, Marcod wrote about the trials of his voyage. When they reached San Francisco, a train took them to St. Louis. While on this train, 2 Igorots froze to death in a boxcar. Once in St. Louis, he and other Igorots built an entire village from bamboo, wood, and leaves sent over from the Philippines. After months of preparation, the gates of the St. Louis World's Fair finally opened.
Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. Don't tell me the lights are shining any place but there. We will dance the hoochie-coochie, I will be your tootsie-wootsie. Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair.
With 1,500 buildings spread over 1,200 acres, it was the largest international exposition the world had ever known. Swarms of people pushed and shoved to gawk at every conceivable machinery, object, and beast, alongside the men, women, and children on display. In this wide expanse of buildings, man-made lakes, and frenzied crowds, no other exhibit was as sought after as the Philippine Reservation. This was the American public's long-awaited glimpse of Filipinos in the flesh.
Straight from the Philippine Islands, the Department of Anthropology hereby presents a polyglot assemblage of Filipino natives, quartered in their respective villages and habitations. A complete inventory of the reservation is as follows: 69 Bontoc Igarots, 25 Suyok Igarots, 18 Tingianes, 34 Negritos, 98 Visayas, 40 Samao Moros, 38 Lanao Moros, 38 Vagabonds, 5 tree-dwelling Moros, 4 Mongians, 2 Midgets, a battalion of 431 Philippine Scouts, and a battalion of 300 Philippine Constabulary. Total, 1,102.
first time ever, native tribes who did not even know of each other's existence now lived side by side in the reservation. Their faces were familiar, but their language and customs were strange and incomprehensible.
Our mission is to represent the many stages of social progress, from the lowest types of barbarous headhunting savagery to the best products of Christian civilization and culture. We will demonstrate the need for a common language and the value of American education to efface tribal antagonisms and prepare our little brown brothers for eventual self-government.
Many uniformed Filipino scouts stood guard to prevent bloodshed between tribes. He recognized the scouts as lowlanders from the dialects they spoke. The Americans paid them well, but all they seemed to do was march around the fairgrounds with their wooden rifles, starting and stopping to the strange rhythms of the white man's drums. He had no respect for these people. One day, he thought, one of their scouts would make a good decoration for his hut, and he would be the envy of his friends. He and his companions gave dance lessons to the American fairgoers, who were delighted to partake of their primitive ways. He observed the activities of the other tribes in the Philippine village. He admired the speed of the Negritos in climbing trees and their skill with weapons, especially the bow and arrow. When night fell, all the buildings were lit, the grounds transformed into a brightly pulsing landscape of light and darkness, the likes of which he had never seen before. There were many small suns, so many that they could not be counted, and they made the whole place light on the darkest nights. Chaperoned by American guards, Marcod was able to leave his village and tour the massive fairgrounds. There were crowds and noise everywhere they went. He marveled at the giant bird cage, which contained hundreds of birds he had never seen. He was taken for a ride on a giant Ferris wheel, which could carry several dozen people in its car.
This is mysterious Asia. Walk in and see the sun dance of Turkey as executed by Princess Spinerita before the Sultan, concluding with the famous dance of the gods.
In the section called Mysterious Asia, Marcod was quite taken by a dancer who performed to the delight of many spectators. He was impressed by the woman's abilities. He was not sure if any of the women in his village, even his wife, could match the strength of this woman's jaw. There were many attractions to be seen, and Marcod's wonder never ceased. He was particularly amused by the rat-eating contest held for the dogs in the fair. He was amazed to find out that even the rats in this land were white, their pink tails matching the color of their handlers' skins. He was very impressed that the white men took good care of their dogs. When he got back home, he thought, he would fatten his dogs with live animals to make them fiercer, so they could absorb the qualities of the prey they devoured. Outside, on the giant path filled with people, even more strange and interesting things were happening. There was a white woman whose bones were more pliant than the softest bamboo stalk he had ever seen. Marcod wondered if her skills would have been very useful in the jungle. He thought that if he told his wife about the bone-twisting woman, she would not believe his story. At a place called Hagenbeck, there were many strange animals he had never seen before. He enjoyed watching the elephants plummet down the chute. On occasion, the Igorots were allowed to shoot the chute themselves, to the obvious delight of the fairgoers. One day, the head of the reservation ordered them to wear trousers and shirts, to adopt to the civilized ways of the fairgoers. Marcod tried on these clothes, and he felt genuine pity for these onlookers, who in shame had to cover their pale bodies from the sun and the wind. Later, the Igorots were ordered to remove this clothing. The spectators who paid to get in wanted to see them as they always were, wild and untouched by the reaches of civilization. They wanted their money's worth, to gaze at the simple ways of the little brown people. Marcod competed in athletic matches arranged by the authorities, testing his strength, speed, and skills against other Filipino tribesmen and people from other lands. Every week, the Igorots slaughtered a dog for food. The fairgoers marveled at these authentic displays of barbaric savagery. The American anthropologists studied the men and women in the Philippine village, meticulously photographing, recording, and charting their body measurements.
Twenty 20% of Igorot adults have abnormal feet. The most common abnormality is the inturning of the great toe. It occurs in all stages from the slightest spreading to that approximating 45 degrees. Like the apes, their prehensile toes are used as claws in climbing the mountainous terrain.
Marcod was promised some money if he agreed to talk to the machine that would record his voice. The other Igorots refused to cooperate, afraid that it would make them lose their voice forever. He heard about this contraption, the one that allowed a man's voice to travel over many miles. Over the course of several months, Marcod told the story of his people and his experiences at the fair.
Ng Amerikano, sad-ama ng ugyat ni kay ng talpig sa tsaki ng kabina. At inilaitin ay umahit sa isang ilimi. May nipay, yalaitin sakit ay magkiliwliwid ken sa kabina. Kung magtanta si Hukas at Pong. Laitin sa ay nagtatintan.
He wondered about the baby girl that was born to this young Negrito couple. The infant was born weak and sickly, and the Americans took her to the infirmary. 3 days later, she died. The Negrito men talked among themselves and shook their heads sadly when the event was mentioned to them. The authorities were fearful of an uprising, and more scouts were posted in the village. There is evil settling in this place. They say their Christian God is strong, but their medicines are weak. An infant had died in our midst. It is not a good sign, and we are fearful of bad things that may happen. The noisy and angry spirits that live in this land are not pleased. Marcod wondered what would have happened if his wife had come with him to this land. Would they have taken the infant away, just like they did with the Negritos? He missed his wife and his home in the mountains. There are people everywhere, and there is no silence until late at night when all the visitors are gone, and we are finally left alone. No place to plant or hunt, no mountains or rivers. Their houses are tall as trees, and so many tiny suns light up the night. Yet of the many things that I have seen, there are very few that we would want with us in our mountains. A few days later, he met Antonio, a man from the Visayan Islands. Antonio spoke in a dialect he understood. Antonio had told Marcod that the Visayans were brought over here to represent the higher caste of Filipinos. Many of these Visayans wanted to return home, but the authorities would not permit it. He said these men were imprisoned in the cuartel building. Antonio warned Marcod to stay away from the scouts who guarded the building. They can't be trusted, he said, even if they speak your language. Most of his time was spent in the village, where he was required to perform ritual dances with his battle axe, shield, and spear, including a sacred head hunting dance with a wooden head substituting for a real one. Celebration of birth, marriage, and death. These rituals were repeated endlessly, devoid of any true connection to the occasion that inspired them. The days dragged on. For his efforts, He was given a few dollars a month, which he used to buy gifts for his wife at home, who was heavy with child. He grew weary. He longed for his village in the mountains. He became preoccupied with the two Bontoc men who died a few weeks ago. He could not remember exactly when they disappeared. His sense of time had changed, each day dissolving into the next. Where would they get buried, he wondered. He knew that it was important for the family of the deceased to perform the funeral ritual, as they have always done. He suspected that something was wrong, because as the weeks passed, he never saw the bodies again. The relatives of the dead men mourned for them, surrounded by the public that had no knowledge of what had happened. The festivities of the fair continued around this pocket of grief, the everyday spectators oblivious to the private pain that unfolded in front of them. Marcotte grew increasingly worried, and he became preoccupied with the thought of his dying before the fair's end. He did not want to disappear like the two men he knew. Even now, no one in the reservation knew what had happened to the bodies. He was very afraid that he might face a similar fate. In the darkness, the silence finally arrived. He saw a place beyond the fairgrounds that carried the sounds he knew so well. He was alone in the forest at last. He hoped that no one would see him, that he could get by unnoticed. He walked for hours, darting in and out of the shadows whenever he heard someone. By day's end, he had reached the edge of the forest. He fell into a deep sleep, and when he came to, there were men whose faces he could not make out. They were shouting to him in English, and he could understand some of the words. They growled at him like hungry mad dogs. He felt the fire in their eyes. They started hitting him with their dark shiny sticks, then their fists, and their blunt heavy shoes. It was strange not to feel the pain of their blows. Before he lost consciousness, he recognized one of their faces. When he came to, he was back in the fairgrounds. For several weeks he was confined in separate quarters. Every day, the same man stood guard. He struggled to remember where he first saw him. Marcotte was not a fearful man. He was a warrior, unafraid of dying if it was a proper death, and if it did not bring dishonor to his family. He could not face the shame of his defeat against the men who left him for dead outside the fairgrounds. He wanted to avenge his loss of face, to regain the respect of the elders in his clan. He vowed to take a head, even if he knew that it was strictly forbidden in this land. After all, the white man broke the law of his people by not returning the bodies of his brothers. Secretly, he kept his rage within. He thought of the brown-skinned man in uniform who guarded his jail. He felt pity and contempt for him. He did not know his name, but he knew that this man's soul had been bought by the white men. Soon he would avenge the honor of his tribe by taking this coward's head. He knew where this man lived. He planned his attack. He felt his blade on the man's neck. He saw the man's headless body being carried on a stick back to the tribe that would bear this shameful death for the generations to come. For the first time in many months, he felt his strength come back. He heard the river of his home as he washed the enemy's blood from his blade. As he traveled the familiar paths, he felt the earth beneath him. He saw the trees that contained the spirits guarding his village. He knew his wife would be proud. He knew that the child she carried would one day speak of his father's courage. He knew that his story would continue and that his honor would live on. In the thunder of the white man's fires that raced towards the sky, he heard the sound of the forest once again. The ending of my grandfather's story continues to elude me, and the question of whether he ever returned home still remains. Traces of his whereabouts disappear soon after the closing of the fair that December. I continued my investigation and followed up on leads I discovered in the National Archives and the Library of Congress. I found a story about a mysterious accident that occurred shortly before the closing of the fair. The body of an unidentified man was discovered, the remains mangled beyond recognition. The authorities were certain that he was a Filipino by the color of his skin and the distinct shape and deformity of his feet. One night, a man climbed to the top of the giant Ferris wheel. At dawn, the machine was started for routine cleaning. The wheel began to move, and the startled man scrambled against the downward movement of the wheel. He slipped and lost his footing, falling headfirst towards the center. He was decapitated before the machine could be stopped, the taut cables and wires catching his still twitching body. My investigation opened up other leads. it was possible that Marcod never returned home, that he joined other Igorots who were placed on display in other fairs and expositions around the country. For many years, all across America, from San Francisco to Coney Island, Philippine natives brought money and fame to their promoters. For months I hunted the dark corners and attics of anthropology and medical museums, trying to follow Marcod's trail. My research indicated that by the spring of 1905, months after the World's Fair ended, 3 Igorot bodies were still interred in a private St. Louis morgue. The bodies were embalmed and placed in caskets, pending final decision by the federal government. I discovered that the Smithsonian collection included 3 Igorot brains from the Philippine reservation. The brains had been removed for delivery immediately after their deaths. So many objects, identities unknown, labeled but nameless. Anonymous stories permanently preserved in a language that can never be understood. I am still not sure of my grandfather's whereabouts. Perhaps his brain lies hidden in a museum somewhere, tucked away on some musty shelf, waiting all these years to be discovered. After all this, I have once again gone back into the hiding places of everyday life. This story has ended, but my search has just begun. If I don't find Marcod, perhaps my children or my children's children will. If they see him, I wonder if they will recognize him. Funding for this program provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Asian American Telecommunications Association.